All right, everyone, we are on to our final cultural lens, which is psychoanalysis, my favorite lens. Um, and the way this one differs from the other few that we've been talking about so far is the other ones we've been talking about so far. So, like feminism, post colonialism, economic theory, those theories all involve outside contexts, right? So, we talked about before how those outside contexts influence the narratives we watch or play, and vice versa, how one influences the other. Psychoanalysis, we're just looking at the characters themselves or the plot itself. We're not really looking so much at outside context as we are the why behind a character's actions, the plot itself, actions and motivations, those kinds of things. I personally enjoy this one much more than the other ones, just because I think that psychology and psychoanalysis, in terms of narrative, is really, really interesting. And this is kind of more along the lines of the kinds of things that I studied in graduate school. Um, so that's kind of how this differs from the other ones that we've discussed. So we're not really applying those outside those outside social contexts and applying them to narratives. We're instead only analyzing the narrative itself. So we're just analyzing the plot and the characters. So it's kind of impossible to separate psychoanalysis as a theory without talking about Freud. And I know Freud is kind of a controversial figure in the psychology community. A lot of psychology majors in psychology as a study uh, don't really take into account Freud's thoughts and ideas as much anymore, as we've moved on to more complex ideas and an understanding of the brain and the mind. But I do think that the psychological theories developed by Freud can help us study human behavior and motivation in these narratives that we watch and play. So, what Freud did is introduced the idea of the unconscious mind, the role of dreams, and the significance of early childhood experiences in shaping adult behavior. So, it's all those things that are kind of hidden that we repress. Basically, this is the study of human behavior and motivation. So, what is the unconscious? So, the unconscious is different than the subconscious. The prefix sub here suggests that there's something underneath, but it's still accessible after some digging, right? We can kind of dive into our subconscious a little bit. The prefix un, so unconscious, suggests that something exists there entirely without our awareness of it. So these are things like our drives and instincts and defenses. So the unconscious consists of repressed drives and instincts, such as sexual desires or the desire for violence. These kinds of things are very primal and innate, and therefore exist in the unconscious mind. As well as this is where things like repression come into play, which is being unable to recall memories of traumatic events because they are too emotionally painful. Um, these kinds of things all play into Freud's ideas of the unconscious mind. As well as this, we're talking about universal human experiences, and this is exactly what I studied in graduate school. This is what I find most interesting in literature. Kind of once you see this circle known as the hero's journey, you really can't unsee it in the narratives that you watch or play or read. Basically, what this says is that unconsciously, we're telling the same stories over and over again, and we have told the same ones since the dawn of time. There are stories told throughout human history that mirror what we watch today. So we're constantly telling the same kinds of characters, the same kinds of stories, redemption, the call to adventure, side characters, villains and heroes. These kinds of things are all the types of stories we have been telling since the dawn of time, and we know this because I can't say that word. Archaeologists have unearthed. Stories that have been preserved, like the Epic of Gilgamesh, if you've ever heard of that or studied that in a literature class, that directly mirror the same kinds of stories we are telling today. So there's something innately human about these kinds of stories that we tell, and innately, there's some kind of deeper understanding as humans that we understand with these stories. This is also known as the monomyth or the hero's journey, and this was posited by Joseph Campbell. It's also called Campbellian theory. And it kind of explains this recurring pattern and structure found in myths, legends, and stories throughout human history, but also but also in stories that we see today. And I've kind of got a couple examples here. The one on the bottom I like better than the one at the top just because it's a little bit easier to see for some reason. Um, but it's really interesting if you go through the types of stories that follow the hero's journey, such as Harry Potter, Star Wars, any stories that have some kind of hero like that faces a villain will probably follow at least some aspects of the hero's journey. And of course, if you want to know more about this, there's tons of YouTube videos on the hero's journey. I find it really fascinating that we keep telling the same kind of story over and over again. Um, but we're just not getting that deep into it here. As well as this, the hero's journey is known as an archetype, so or as being archetypal. This embodies a recurrent universal pattern and often holds deep unconscious, there's that word again, psychological significance. So what this is saying is that we inherently have the knowledge of these archetypes in our unconscious. We already inherently understand what a hero is as a child, what a villain is as a child. These kinds of things are already kind of in our unconscious as humans. And so, of course, they're going to appear in our narratives, in our stories. Um, some examples of these Jungian archetypes in narratives would be the hero, the shadow, so like the villain, the wise old man or mentor, the wizard figure, the mother, the temptress, side comic relief characters, anti-heroes, and villains. These type of I don't want to say the word tropes, but these types of categorizations, we could all think of an example for probably every single one of these here, right? That's because they're archetypal. That's because they are part of this unconscious story that we keep telling over and over again as part of our universal human experience. As well as this, we will often see plots existing in trinities. So there's a beginning, middle, and an end to a plot. As well as this, hero groups or friend groups consisting of three. If you go through your favorite stories. There's often a beginning, a middle, and end. There's often a clear beginning, middle, and end. As well as this, there's often um, a friend group that exists in a group of three, right? So once again, Star Wars and Harry Potter, the hero group consists of three. There is something inherently balanced about the number three here that wouldn't be as balanced if it were two or four. Something about the number three and things existing in groups of three really appeals to our unconscious mind as humans, which I think is very interesting. As well as this, the id, ego, and superego also exists in a trinity, in a group of three. And this is the idea of Freud's tripartite model. You've probably heard of the word ego before, but I kind of want to talk about what Freud meant by his definition of the word ego. So here we have the id, the ego, and the superego. So the id are those unconscious desires. So as Parker says, the seething cauldron of basic drives in their primitive, selfish, unorganized state. That's kind of the state that a toddler exists in. So a toddler who throws tantrums because they don't understand why they can't get, mine, 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 this is my toy, that's mine, I don't want to share. Those kinds of things are part of our primitive, selfish, an organized state. Things like the desire for violence or sexual urges, these are all also part of the id. And there are also things that as we grow up, we repress it. So as we learn, to not act like a toddler anymore, we repress that id deep down and that becomes part of our unconscious. Um, as well as this, we have the ego. The ego is kind of the mediator between the two. It's what we learn as children to present to the world. Now, nobody's perfect. No one's in the super ego all the time, right? But it's also rare to find someone completely in their id as well. The ego is kind of just like everyone in their normal, relaxed, normal state. It's the mediator between the two extremes of the id and the unconscious and the super ego here. The superego is the moral conscious with its sense of right and wrong. So now, regardless of what religion you believe in or uh, what what political affiliations you have or anything like that, I feel like inherently we all have a sense of what is right and wrong. As far as like, I'm sure everyone in this class can agree that murdering somebody is wrong, right? There's just something inherently human about knowing that knowing what is right and wrong. And that's the superego here. That's the moralizing conscious. Now, with repression, this replaces the id for the ego. So, like I said, when you grow up and you learn how to manage those primitive, unorganized states of the unconscious mind, the repression then replaces that unconscious primal desires of the id with the ego, which is kind of like the mask that we present to the world and how we operate in the world as adults. Okay, so it is almost impossible for a narrative to not contain at least one archetype. You could give me any movie, any TV show, any video game, and I can find you an archetype in it. It's really interesting how we can't seem to break the mold as humans of what kinds of stories we tell, and that we keep telling the same kinds of stories over and over again. Every single narrative that you watch or read or play is going to contain at least one archetype. So, Harry Potter, Percy Jackson, the Olympians, and Star Wars are all modern examples that contain archetypes. So, I've kind of got an example here of how we keep telling the same kind of story over and over again. So, for example, in all three of these stories, you have a hero and a mentor relationship. So, in Harry Potter, your hero is obviously the main character, Harry Potter. His mentor is the wise old wizard, Dumbledore. In Percy Jackson, the hero is Percy. The mentor is Chiron. In Star Wars, your hero is Luke, and your mentor is Obi-Wan and Yoda. So we still have that young hero coming into themselves, coming of age, as well as being mentored by that older, wiser wizard kind of figure. We keep telling that same story over and over again, but we also see it not just in these huge epics and these huge movies, but we also see it in cartoons. I mean, we can see it in SpongeBob here. SpongeBob's our protagonist, our hero, if you will. And Patrick Star serves as the comic relief or the best friend side character. There's often a best friend side character, and that best friend side character is also often portrayed as dumb or the comic relief or those kinds of things. For some reason, I'm also thinking of Diary of a Wimpy Kid. If you ever watch this or watch those movies or those books, same kind of thing here. We're still telling the same story here, and of course, Plankton as the villain. So, just think for a second and go through either your favorite movie or something you've watched recently and try to think of an archetype because I guarantee that you will find one. So here's an example of some kinds of lines of thinking that we might want to be moving towards as we get into our thesis statements, and if you want to write about psychoanalysis as your main topic of focus for your final paper. So Freud posits that traumatic experiences, particularly in childhood, lead to the repression of the id. How might we see this in someone like Bruce Wayne? These are great questions to ask yourself if you're rewatching the movie that you might want to write about. So how might we see these archetypes portrayed on screen? And then another example, and also a basic thesis statement. Eleven from Stranger Things is unable to process the traumatic events of her early childhood, and therefore this manifests as a repression of her id and subsequently an outburst of uncontrolled violence. These are the kind of arguments that I want you all to be making, and these lines of and to be understanding these lines of thinking for how to see archetypes in film, television, and video games. If you have any questions, feel free to email me.